and welcome to Stories Lived, Stories Told. Thank you for joining me for this very special bonus episode today. Today we are doing something a little different. In this conversation, I am joined by one of the CMM Institute Board of Stewards members, and that is Sergej van Middendorp, who I have worked closely with in the process of developing this podcast behind the scenes. And so I'm so thankful that you are going to get to hear directly from him today. The idea for doing these reflection episodes came actually when I was in a meeting with Sergej and also Barbara McKay, who you'll remember we had a conversation with in episode 5, who is someone else who is also on the board of stewards for the CMM Institute. And Barbara suggested, what if we recorded some reflection episodes? If you've listened to, any of my other episodes and heard me say anything about CMM, you'll know that reflection is an important part of the conversation. And so it only felt natural to try this out and see what happens. Today, Sergej and I are going to reflect on the very first episodes from this season, the 2 episodes that we had with Stephanie Higgs. And then we're also going to talk about the conversations more recently that we had with Chris Wells and Emma Nicholson. We felt like these 2 went together because they both touched on elements of giftedness. And that was kind of a very simple starting place to say, let's see what other meaning arises when we talk about these 2 together. I think you'll hear in Sergej and I's reflection, we realize that there's a lot more similarities or other even more significant themes that we felt arose in both of those conversations. So of course you'll want to go back and listen to those conversations before you listen to this one. I don't think it'll make much sense if you haven't done that yet. But if you have already listened to those, my real hope is that maybe you've been doing some of your own reflection on those episodes and that we can just add to that and keep that conversation going. I don't think there's really much else to say as a preface other than I'm excited for you to join me and Sergej in this conversation today, and let's jump right in. Hi, Sergej. Thanks so much for being here for this reflection conversation.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to this.
I'm really looking forward to this. And, we've gotten to speak a number of times and work very closely together. And so I'm really excited for the listeners to get to hear your voice and your perspective, because it's always one that I've valued when we've spoken, not in a recording setting. And now here we are in a recording setting. And so please give us a little introduction so people can know who you are as we go into our reflection today.
Yeah, thanks, Abbie. My name is Sergej van Middendorp. I'm 51 years old. I live here in the Netherlands with Tekla, my wife, and our 2 kids, who are now young adults, have just left our home. And in my work and research, I use CMM, so that's one thing that connects us. I work mainly in the Dutch healthcare industry, supporting IT companies to work together. In one sense, they are competitors. In another sense, they need to solve issues that are beyond themselves and have to work together. And I facilitate that collaboration around open standards so that we can help evolve the healthcare system to also become more collaborative, which is in dire need for Netherlands. So that's a very brief way of introducing myself.
Absolutely. And of course, we were first connected because you are one of the stewards for the CMM Institute. Can you tell me about how long you've been on the board of stewards and how you first came to learn about CMM?
Yes, I came to learn about CMM in 2010 while I was in my PhD program with Fielding Graduate University. Actually, I was having a portfolio review with my mentor at the time, and he was reflecting on the overview I presented him with and my direction for going forward. And then he suddenly thought, hey, there might be something interesting for you here this week. There's a session on CMM. You may not have heard of it, but I think it's interesting for you. So I followed up on that lead and I joined that session, and I was really struck by how CMM helped me make sense of difficult conversations I was having in my practice, in my research, in my life. And I was sort of hooked on the method. I really saw how that could really help me evolve as a person and a professional. So I learned all about it that I could. I had the pleasure and honor to still learn with Barnett Pierce, one of the co-founders of CMM, in his last year of being alive. He kept teaching till he passed. The CMM Institute was founded in that same year. So I joined as an associate and I participated in several events. And in 2015, I was asked to join the board of Stewards, and I did. So I've been doing that for about 8 years now.
Well, I'm excited to see how both of our perspectives on CMM are able to contribute to this conversation today. I've certainly learned over my course of knowing about this theory and doing the podcast that there's so many different ways to be CMM-ish. And that's what I love, that the theory itself and you and the others who practice it leave so much room for that to happen, which, in and of itself is a great practice in emergence. So I know emergence is certainly something that we will talk about today, that I saw happen in both my conversation with Stephanie and my conversation with Chris and Emma, but also hopefully something that we can embody as we go through the conversations too.
Yes.
Sergej, the first thing I want to talk to you about is something that we've talked about before, that you have a personal connection to parts of the themes of both of those episodes, or, all 4 of those episodes, both of those conversations. I wonder what it meant to you to hear these conversations, considering your context and your personal relationship to some of these conversations that maybe feel newer, or maybe that language feels helpful.
Yes, the idea of giftedness does play a role in our lives, if only recently, because we found out that that label was helpful in what we were struggling with as a family only a few years ago. So our kids and we as a family had been struggling for longer with issues adapting to the school system, issues in finding motivation to learn, issues in persisting with staying in school. So our daughter actually dropped out of school at some point. And all the while we hadn't a good grasp on what was happening, or at least something that really helped. And the idea of giftedness was a thing that came on our path, and we explored that idea, and it really helped making sense of the situation, making sense of our history, and also in changing things going forward from that point. So, but as you hear, I consciously frame it as a label, or a way of seeing the situation, rather than something that is actually happening.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, and it contributes to the conversation that Chris and Emma and I were having, where they explained that being gifted meant different things to both of them in their childhood and now in their adulthood, or maybe only things that they've only known to use that label retroactively, maybe similar to your experience. And so I see a hope for them being that they could offer the label to people, make it more accessible in ways that it wasn't to them, so that it's not only retroactive, that people are able to have the understanding, but people in the moments of their lives being able to have that language.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. And that was also one thing I was struck by. At some point, I think Emma said, if it's a gift, can I give it back?
Yeah.
And in how they make sense of it and how they share about their giftedness and their lives, you see that this struggle is seems to be at least an integral part of it. It's not easy for many people being gifted. And apparently you can have a lot of struggles without even knowing that that label might help you. Or in the case of Chris and Emma, they knew this early in their lives, but it didn't really help them. It actually made a negative difference in many shapes and forms. So the idea of disintegration and the theory of positive disintegration as a larger frame also is really helpful in this respect, I think.
One of the themes that came up for me as I listened to my conversation with Stephanie and listened back to my conversation with Chris and Emma was this relationship between differences and sameness. in that it almost feels like two sides of the same coin. Like maybe they feel like polar opposites, but they have a closer relationship than we might realize. And I thought it was so interesting that in having a label of your difference, because that's exactly how Chris and Emma described it, of saying, I knew something was different about me. And yet when you find the label and you say, oh, well, other people have experienced this too, or when they start talking about it on their podcast and other people write in and say, oh, that's exactly what I'm experiencing, that in your differenceness, you can find community and sameness among other people, even if they have different differences. I think that's just an interesting thing that emerged in the conversation and idea that I want to keep thinking about, in the way that it's not only important for us to say, I've had this experience, and for someone else to say, oh, me too, I've had that exact same experience. But there's also power in saying, I've had this experience, and someone else saying, oh, well, I haven't had that exact same experience, but you sharing yours makes me feel like I can share mine. Does that make sense? Was that too convoluted?
No, that does make sense. And while you were saying that, I was thinking about the idea of difference and loneliness. I think I heard that in Emma's story when she referred to the, is it the ugly duckling? Discovering she's a swan, already having seen other swans in her life, but thinking, that's not me.
Yeah.
So first identifying something that is actually similar as different, and your own difference as an instigator of loneliness. So finding your tribe is something I often hear. People also come to CMM, for example, in our community.
Yeah.
So along a specific aspect of your personality or your life, finding others who share that is something important, I think, especially if we evolve and grow and learn different things. At the same time, addressing the most difficult issues in our world is often also local, right? A school. Stephanie is working in, brings people together from a local community, and there's a lot of difference that you have to navigate together to make something work. So I think both are very important.
Yeah.
But only living in one of both may instigate loneliness and other issues.
Yeah, because the idea of different really came up when I was first listening to Stephanie's, and she, uses the word differentiation for those individualized learning plans that she makes. And that is an actual process that she goes through. And she even talks about that her position in her school to be able to assist other teachers and take the time and the energy to put into those individualized learning plans is kind of a unique one, that not every school has that. And so there hasn't always been maybe that focus or that attention and care given to the different needs of students in the school setting, let alone outside of that.
Yes, that's a part of the conversation with Stephanie that struck me too. And her school is lucky to have someone like her doing that. And not only for gifted but for any difference, I think, that presents itself in the children showing up to a school might be a way to make education work better in that kid's life, and by extension in their family's life.
Yeah.
Very difficult in the school system as it was designed in the modern era.
Yeah.
I recently heard Zach Stein, I think, who's a futurist in education, reflect that these schools were designed to create workers for our factories.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sameness and similarity was sort of the design behind bringing people in school. So he reflected on that by saying, if we are going to talk about the future of education, we're going to talk about the end of schools. Maybe Stephanie's schools and her being able to bring out at least to differentiate with the gifted kids in this case is one way of going about it.
Yeah, it feels like a real rebellion against that system and the way that it was designed. And it goes back to this larger CMM language of what can we do to create better social worlds. It's almost this idea of school systems as they exist as kind of, here's the one way things are done. We are going to shape these individuals, conform them so that they fit in that system we've already created. But Stephanie's way of doing things, or this idea of let's go out and change the social world, says, let's acknowledge the way that all of these individuals are, which are all different, and go make a system that works for as many of them as possible. So instead of, changing the person to fit the social world, change the social world to be able to fit the people inside of it. And so it's actually a system that works for people.
Yes, I think that's part of a better future social world when it comes to schools and education.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's quite complex and hard to go about this.
Mm-hmm.
So it's great that we could learn from Stephanie how she's doing this, and hearing her examples of things she does differently in relating with the kids she's able to support was very inspiring.
I'm curious if when you were listening to either of these conversations, if there were moments where you thought, oh, I really wish Abbie would have asked that, or this feels like it's missing, or I wish I could know more about X, Y, or Z.
Not necessarily in the conversations themselves, because they were very rich and emergent. And I really appreciate how you and your guests make each episode a whole in itself. What I'm curious about when I listen to these episodes is how we bring them together, how we relate one to another, and how we explore themes across episodes, as we are doing now. So I really appreciate this chance between the two of us to reflect on these 4 episodes and these 3 guests. And I really am curious to what will happen if we keep doing that. Yeah.
I think it's helpful feels like putting together a puzzle, like maybe each episode or each conversation in this podcast, but also like in a person's life. Every conversation's a puzzle piece, and that's cool to have on its own. But if you do take the time like we're taking now to step back and reflect, then you might start to be able to see the bigger picture that comes together. And I find a lot of value in that for me when I step back in my life and I'm able to say, oh, I kind of see these themes emerging in these events that have happened recently, or these experiences that I've had, or these things that I'm starting to look back on from my childhood, or the lessons that were taught to me, the messages that I received. You can start to see these bigger puzzles out of these smaller puzzle pieces. I love this metaphor because I actually do love to do puzzles. And the funny story is that my mom and I were trying to do one when I was still living at home. And I had bought this one and I thought the picture was so pretty. And then I got it out of the box, and this art style of it was so pixelated that we literally could not finish this puzzle, because I look at a piece and I say, I have no idea what I'm looking at. It was just not detailed enough. So it kind of feels like in life, maybe you have a really blurry puzzle piece in front of you. That's a conversation you had, but you don't know what to do with it. But it's all part of one bigger picture. And maybe the picture makes sense when you put it with the other pieces, but on its own, it looks a little blurry.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor and a great story, by the way. I recall an earlier episode that we didn't put on our list to reflect on today, where metaphor came up too.
Yep.
And I think the story there was that, but the puzzle of life doesn't have a box, maybe doesn't have a frame.
Yep.
However, we do frame all the time, maybe to make some coherence of what we're seeing. Like in your case, the pieces being very different from the picture you saw on the box. You had to bring very different skills probably to the puzzle than you had thought beforehand. And maybe learn something new. Did you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. A new way of looking at things, a new lens. And well, to kind of answer my own question to you about, what was missing or what I wish I would have asked, is that it's interesting because I have, outside of this recording, had other conversations with other of the stewards of the board or other people who said, oh, I really wanted to know this about Stephanie, or, oh, I was so curious when she said this of like this other question. And it's hard for me not to go, oh, just experience, crazy regret of like, I should have known. Of course I should have asked that. But, again, with the emergence, which is something I'm definitely having to learn, that does not come as natural to me. I'm more naturally, instinctively a planner. And so embracing emergence has really been a process for me throughout this. And I think it's, as I'm preparing for these conversations, I come up with some questions. I learn about my guests more to make sure I have an understanding of them. And I send them a couple questions so they can kind of know what I want to talk about. And then I let it go beyond that. And the actual conversation itself is really rooted in emergence. But then on the other end of it too, after the conversation has happened, I can't let myself get so stuck in, oh, well, if only I had planned, I would have known to ask this question, or I really wanted to ask that question, but then the conversation didn't go that direction. And it's kind of interesting to have to balance those emotions of like really honestly regret, and sometimes where I'm thinking, oh, that would have made it so much richer And so a little bit letting go of controlling the outcome has been my experience with embracing emergence in these conversations.
Thanks for sharing that, Abbie. I'm really struck by what you're saying here, as I recognize this in my own life. I would call myself a planner too. I was struck by Stephanie, I think early in her first episode, she says she refers to the Enneagram and her being a type 7.
Yep.
I've learned a bit about that framework too. And in that framework, I'm a 7 too.
Yeah.
And planning is a fixation of the type 7. So I recognize really having all scenarios and many plans, always more than I can ever realize. And throughout the last few years, I've learned that the opposite of that, which is actually something you could aspire to as an Enneagram 7 in that frame, is to submit to the plan as it presents itself in the moment, and to let go of that. And that seems something you are doing when you do step into the conversations with your guests, and something really beautiful then emerges in each episode. And the imperfection of having to live with what came out of that, I recognize that in projects I've done as well. Yeah.
Well, I think for someone like, you and me, and maybe Stephanie even, is that you maybe learn over your life that you can make really beautiful things if you have a plan. Like, I've had some good plans. I've made some good things happen. And so you really have to convince yourself that good things can also happen if you just let them emerge, that it's not all on your shoulders to create the really beautiful thing. And that whether you want to believe it or not, maybe something even more beautiful could happen if you let go of that plan, if you let that plan emerge. But yeah, again, I love emergence because it shows up in the way we talk, and then also the content of what we're talking about. Because as I listen back to these conversations, I just kind of chuckled again, like I did the first time hearing it, when Stephanie said that she sometimes has 4 plans in a night and she's running from place to place and she's so busy and jumping from one plan to the next. And it just makes so much sense to me how I don't do that, but I can understand the idea of feeling like you want to be busy, feeling like you want to make commitments to all these people in your life, and planning because of the kind of culture that's shaped us, at least, in the United States, in this kind of idea of lifestyle of capitalism that is very go, go, go. It's good to be busy. You have to earn rest. And it's these ideas that get into us of we need to be busy all the time. But I think about what is missing if you have 5 plans a night and you go to your one plan, and then after an hour you say, okay, well, I got to go to the next thing. But if you had given time to let that moment with whoever you were with breathe, what could emerge there?
Yeah, from a different perspective, one that Chris and Emma, I think, bring in of overexcitabilities. I recognize in myself also most of the 5 overexcitabilities that were discussed in that episode.
Yeah.
It's also one way of making sense of and also of embracing my personality rather than wanting to change that personality. So if I wouldn't also be very active in all these aspects, I would become very bored.
Yeah.
And so whether I look at it from the Enneagram or from the perspective of overexcitabilities, these different perspectives always highlight something and hide something.
Yeah.
And indeed, the switching itself maybe is something we could consider also in a CMM-ish way, right? Acknowledging there are multiple perspectives or many ways to look at your own story or at the story of how we are both excited and also want to be mindful at the same time. And where does this come from? It's really helpful that we are all there's not only one story. Yes, we are each our own story, but we are each also many stories. And that in itself, of course, is like, oh, I'm many stories. That's an exciting idea in itself.
It is. And I think separate of the conversations I have on the podcast, but also something that they contribute to, is a theme that I see in my life, is this idea of just finding balance in everything. Or another way I'd say that is I really like this concept of both and, which is another way to say that it's complex and there's multiple stories. Both this is true and that is true, even if they might seem contradictory. Just multiple things can be true at the same time. This is funny that someone just sent this to me yesterday. One of my friends who's a journalist sent me this article from a woman named Amanda Ripley about the idea of complicating the narrative. And it was specifically talking about journalists and the kinds of questions they ask, and being journalists in a polarized society, and how can we ask questions that bring people into deeper, more nuanced conversations. And I read that article and I thought it feels so CMM-ish, first of all, and feels like something I want to be trying to do in my podcast conversations too, and in my life conversations too, of asking those questions that acknowledge the premise that there's more stories here to be told. Like Chris and Emma talked about that, even saying, okay, you are gifted. The story there is not just, that means you're a high achiever. For Chris and Emma, it also meant all of these other things, some of which were positive and some of which were real struggles. But again, all those stories are those both ands that are true at the same time. We sell ourselves short when we don't try to complicate the narrative, or we don't tell complicated stories about ourselves because we don't think, I don't know, other people can handle it or will understand. But I think it's really valuable when we can like complicate our own narrative, I guess is how I want to say that, and give other people the space to embrace their fully complicated narratives too.
Yeah, I really love what you're saying here and what you bring into the conversation. I'm thinking about something I think Stephanie said about greeting her kids in the class after spring break, where she asks them how their spring break was. And instead of just following her plan to then go into the next teaching activity, she offers the idea for the kids that they could also ask her how her spring break was. Mm-hmm. So what she does there, as I heard her say that, is both retain the idea that there's dissimilarity between them as human beings, her being in the role of teacher, them being in the role of kids being taught, and the similarity as human beings in the sense they've both had a spring break and they are curious in a reciprocal way about how that was. And you can ask your teacher as a human being how her spring break was in this case. That also complicates, I think, already at a very young age, the situation, that the pattern that they find themselves in, and plays different constellations in that situation that might, if we repeat this often and often and often, help us complicate our stories and appreciate the complexity and the many different perspectives that are always in every situation. So we hopefully also become more deliberate in how we engage with our differences.
I love the way you're putting it, because it's kind of combining that very first thing we talked about and the idea of both and of, in Stephanie's actions, she is saying we are both different and the same. And I think that's maybe a good lens to go through conversations with too, approaching people and understanding that you are both different and the same as them, and to be able to celebrate both of those, I think. Because that's what I think Stephanie talks about in her work, whether she's explicitly saying it, it's what's happening, is that she is creating a place, a social world in her school where they are celebrating the differences, or normalizing them at the very least, which is still powerful. And also she teaches that reciprocity and tries to find the shared humanity.
Yes, and I think what she does by doing that and by living that story, because she's so vibrantly present in how she actually, I could really clearly see her doing that, even if it is an audio podcast. It was very vivid as I heard her share that. I think she does something what we really try to do in the CMM Institute as well, is to foster what we call personal and social evolution. Yeah. And one of the miracles that Barnett wrote about in one of his last writing is that we are reflexively self-aware. Mm-hmm. And also in the theory of positive disintegration that Chris and Emma shared with us, there is this idea of a spontaneous multi-level disintegration, which I correlate with that term of becoming reflexively self-aware.
Yeah.
Somehow you emerge from a disintegration struggle that you have in your life, and then all of a sudden you think, hey, there is something in me that can make sense of the process as a process that I've done. And the sooner we support kids, I think, in developing those skills, in trying out plays or games in the classroom with this, the more chance we have that they will go through that period of disintegration in their lives and come out on the other side and maybe healthier than they got in. That somehow feels important.
One of the things that Stephanie explicitly said, and I think it showed up in my conversation with Emma and Chris too, is she said, I've never seen my next turn in education coming. And I think that's a great thing to admit, because we want to look back and say, oh yeah, of course that path happened to get me where I am now, because it feels like that sometimes. But again, honestly, for as much as we can plan, there's a lot in life that just has to emerge, and we don't have control over it. And it's going to emerge one way or the other. And we don't know what the turn after that will be, and the turn after that, and the turn after that. And so I just thought it was really honest of her to say, I had no idea that this is what would happen. Because I also think there's maybe a value around, you ask someone who's in high school, well, what are you going to do? What's your plan? And people want to hear that, well, I'm going to college and I'm going to study this and I'm going to do this job and have this degree and I'm going to XYZ. People like to hear that other people have a plan, because that sounds really nice. But so much of it is just emergence. And like you're saying, like Chris and Emma said too, I think Chris was mentioning the difference between her dad and her, and how she was able to experience that multi-level disintegration in a positive way, whereas she has, moved through that where he was unable to. And she said that part of that was the relationships that she had, but also she kind of acknowledged, like, I don't know what it was. What is the difference between someone who can have a disintegration that's positive and a disintegration that is not?
Yeah, what emerges in our conversation here for me is the idea of mystery that we use in CMM. So knowing that we don't know, maybe more than we would like to admit.
Yeah.
And pointing to that not knowing is a very powerful way of appreciating that, I think.
Yeah.
And then maybe even resisting the temptation to try to answer the own question brings in a lot of, in my experience, I think power is a good word, not in a formal or personal sense, but in a relational sense, maybe, to relate to a bigger picture that we are all part of, that we don't know. But something striking in that specific story that Chris shared was also her relationships, indeed, being part of a social world with other people who care about you and want the best for you as a very important condition for growth.
Yeah.
That's the hope, I think, from all these stories that we've heard. Having teachers like Stephanie in your life, of keep finding people on your path that really care about you and want to help you through, even if your own father can't. Yeah.
In these two conversations, and almost every conversation I've recorded, I say, who are you? What's your story? Introduce yourself. And people almost always immediately start talking about their relationships. Like, people know that those are important for understanding who they are in one way or another. And it's whether you realize it on the level that we're talking about it or not, I think people know. They feel that those relationships are meaningful to understanding who they are.
Yes.
The other thing that was coming up when you were first talking is that, again, going back to this idea of balance, it's not that I need to never plan for anything just because I'm more naturally a planner, but it's almost like this idea coming to me of, if you're going to plan for emergence, where it's maybe this kind of ironic relationship between the ideas of having a plan and being maybe spontaneous or improving, which is language that I talked with Rick Spann about in my conversation with him. And that's just kind of a funny and true, I think, relationship to say, plan for emergence, plan for mystery, plan for the unexpected.
Yeah, I love the paradox in that. And I also love the English word practice for this, as it has this double meaning, practicing, but also as if it is still for something that you're going to do later.
Yeah.
While it is also doing it at the same time. So there's this double meaning to that. We don't have that exact same meaning in Dutch in one word. So I really love that. And planning for emergence sort of, puts that word under tension and says, so how do we do that? And I think it was Barnett who said somewhere that sharpening a tool is never wasted time. So that brings back the idea of practical theory.
Yeah.
That he talked about, and of course the theory of positive disintegration, the theory of CMM that you try to sort of juxtapose also in your conversation with Chris and Emma, and found a lot of resonance between the two. I think are interesting in the sense that they, at least positive disintegration theory in that conversation, also showed up as something, if you know, as a stairs metaphor, I think, if you know the steps on the stairs, then suddenly it becomes very practical to see, hey, this is something I could do next.
Yeah.
And I think that emergence relationship lies between theory and practice somehow. If you are able to bring your own story and the theory together, and you can see what is realistically emerging on your path as a possibility, then the plan unfolds as a next step. However, I've also found myself in situations where I have been planning something very deliberately, and the next step, and the next step, and the next step, and then you're caught in planning.
Yeah.
Then the practice becomes planning itself, and then planning for emergence as a paradox or as a metaphor is really helpful. So thank you for offering that.
Yes. What I see come up in my conversation with Stephanie and my conversation with Chris and Emma that I hadn't thought about when I originally recorded these or listened back to them even, but it's just coming up right now, is that they both are living in the space of how can I look back while I'm also looking forward in a way? Because I hear Chris and Emma talk about, well, through my relationship to the theory of positive disintegration, through finding out about overexcitability and all this different language, retroactively, I'm able to go back and heal maybe my younger self, or to understand things about my past or other people's past in this way. In a similar way, Stephanie and I talked about being dysregulated, and that she said, now that I have that language, I'm able to have so much more grace for my mom when we were younger. She didn't have that language, but I can look back and color that in and know that that's what was going on, a dysregulation, and we just didn't have the tools to understand it. And now at the same time, they're all looking forward. I think Stephanie's trying to say, how can I pass along these things that I've learned? That's something she talked about. I said, what's the new story you're trying to tell? And she says, what is my legacy? What am I trying to pass on to these students and the other people I work with too? Chris and Emma do it through their podcast. So it's a looking back and a looking forward at the same time of how do we retroactively heal ourselves, our pasts, find more grace for other people, find more understanding. And then how do we set up future generations, other people in their lives, to be able to embrace this going forward?
Yeah, that makes me think of something Barnett told me, is that the meaning of something that's already happened is always contingent on what's going to happen next.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's actually a very hopeful idea. So what we learn now, indeed, retrospectively, changes the sense making we've done earlier about our stories or our histories even. There's also this loosening of meaning in that idea that generates future possibilities. So once I also learned about the theory of positive disintegration from Lotte van Lith, who lives here in the Netherlands. That's how I got to know about Emma's work in the first place. And learning about that theory really gave me a new lens to make sense of some of the happenings in our own family, in my own life. And that also changes how I look to the future. And in that sense, every theory Dysregulation, for example, I resonates for me with the theory of polyvagal theory. Have you heard of that?
I'm not super familiar with it.
Well, that's also a theory that's emergent as something in psychotherapy, psychology, education, and looks at the role of our nervous system and how that influences our bodily sensations, and through that, our mental states, rather than so a very embodied way of looking at psychology, and a really helpful language to understand our states of mind, our feelings, our emotions in certain situations, and practically do something about them. So the practical value of theory or learning, sense making, meaning making as something valuable in and of itself actually sort of is for me in this part of our conversation. So how does that show up in your work and life? How do you make sense of this?
Really, one of the most exciting and empowering concepts from CMN for me is the idea that we create meaning. That's been a huge transformation. I enter into the spaces of my life differently with that in mind. I'm almost always thinking about it because it's just, for me, it's whether I decide to make new meaning of something or not, it's a great practice to just try on what it feels like. What if that meant something different to me? What if I created the meaning around that differently? What are the contexts that played into the way I made meaning in the first place? What's different now? How is that meaning changing? And yeah, exactly what you said that Barnett said. The meaning of something that's already happened is contingent on what happens next. Is that we are all always doing that, looking back and looking forward. The idea of creating meaning, I said it already, but it's an empowering one. I don't know if other people experience it in that way, but it's that personal evolution part of the CMM Institute's personal and social evolution, is that it gives you that personal power in a way to relate to things differently, to understand things differently. It just makes me feel I'm not at the whim of some totally big, uncontrollable thing. In so many ways, I absolutely am, and we all are, because again, there's so much we can't control. But if I can control the meaning I make, that feels like that gives me just enough power to hang on to then be able to have peace, or understanding or acceptance around everything else that is out of my control that I have to let emerge.
That sounds really powerful, Abbie. Yeah. And hopeful too, because if we can appreciate indeed that we are part of this much bigger system, most of which is indeed outside of our control, yet we do have some influence on what we are making in our small space, in our personal relationships. And those change us, we change them. And we make that meaning. We have this small space that we can make better.
Okay, that is where we end our reflection with Sergej. I thought that this conversation was incredibly fruitful, and the initial conversations I had with Stephanie, Chris, and Emma left me with a lot to think about. And then this conversation just added that many more layers to keep thinking about. So it's a true testament, I think, to the fact that these conversations don't really end when the episodes end. So I'm excited to just see what else comes up as we continue to do more of these reflection episodes. As always, I am supported not only financially, but in many ways by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. It's people like Sergej, people like Barbara, and many others that you haven't got to meet yet, but I'm hoping you will over the course of these reflection episodes that make these conversations possible and encourage me on in my work and really just guide me in really wonderful ways. I think we've already done the really great next turn of reflecting, and if you feel like there's more to think about, then obviously keep that up. But the other next turns that I'll offer you at the end of this conversation are to follow the show wherever you listen. I'm hoping to release more bonus episodes like this, so maybe you know that I release episodes every Monday, our regular episodes every Monday, but you'll be getting a couple more of these bonus Friday episodes. And so if you follow, you'll get notified when new episodes come out so you won't miss any of those. Also, it is so helpful if you can rate and review the show. If you're on Spotify, it's right there at the top. If you're on Apple Podcasts, you can scroll down to the bottom. It's super easy to do. And again, super helpful to get the podcasts in front of more people. And as always, I really appreciate your feedback. The other next turn I want to offer is to connect with me. And I have an Instagram, which is at Stories Lived, Stories Told Pod. I have a YouTube page, which is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and a website, storieslived.storiestold.com. And I offer all of these platforms as a way to keep these conversations going. I want to hear from you. I want to be in dialogue with you. And so I hope you'll reach out. Any questions, feelings, or ideas that you have. And thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious. And thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.